Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine a wave of mass killings in Haiti's Artibonite department, driven by intensifying gang competition and limited state control. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at Ukraine's significantly escalated deep strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure, ongoing tensions between the United States and Iran amid stalled peace efforts, and the growing risk of retaliatory strikes across the Gulf. We also assess the entry of the Houthis into the conflict and the rising instability in Somalia, following the forced resignation of a regional leader. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover protests in Nepal following the arrest of a former prime minister and the potential for further unrest depending on the outcome of legal proceedings. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where mass killings in Haiti's Artibonite department highlight intensifying gang competition and the state's limited ability to respond. On March 30th and April 1st, Haitian gangs carried out a wave of mass killings in the Petite Rivière area in the northwestern Artibonite department. Dozens of people were killed, with some NGOs provisionally indicating a death toll of around 70, and approximately 6,000 were displaced. According to local media, the attacks took place during a local festival and were carried out by the Grand Griffe gang, along with a local gang leader known as T. Kenken. The same gang had already attacked the area in April 2024, reportedly killing at least 50 people. On April 1st, Haitian police carried out operations across several parts of Artibonite, aiming to prevent further gang attacks. Officials stated that, although gang members had withdrawn from Petite Rivière ahead of the police's arrival, they were regrouping and preparing to attack the town of Marchand des Salines, around 20 kilometers to the north of the previously targeted area. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The Artibonite department on Haiti's northwestern coast is a key agricultural center for cereal production. Since 2023, intensifying gang violence has severely disrupted local output and exacerbated food insecurity, likely increasing the area's strategic importance. Petite Rivière lies around 12 kilometers east of Route Nationale 1, a critical north-south transport corridor linking Port-au-Prince to Cap Haitien. This route serves as a primary channel for humanitarian aid and food distribution from Cap Haitien, the country's main port of entry for such assistance. The town is also just north of Route Départementale 11, a key roadway that connects the RN1 to inland agricultural areas and major population centers such as Mirebalais. Mirebalais sits on Route Nationale 3, a separate major corridor linking the capital to Cap Haitien. Securing control over these routes would likely enable gangs to disrupt humanitarian aid convoys and restrict the movement of assistance, exacerbating local shortages and increasing the population's dependence on illicit networks operated by the gangs. Control of key corridors such as RN1 and RD11 also undermines the central government's ability to project authority and maintain freedom of movement, likely eroding state legitimacy. Large-scale killings by gangs have become increasingly common in Haiti, particularly following the escalation of the gang war between 2023 and 2024. In October 2024, the Grand Griffe gang carried out a massacre in Pont-Sondé, also in Artibonite, killing at least 115 people and injuring dozens. The attack was reportedly an act of retaliation against a community accused of supporting a rival gang. In December 2024, the Wharf Jérémie gang killed more than 200 people in Cité Soleil, Port-au-Prince. The attack was reportedly ordered by gang leader Mikanor, who blamed elderly residents for practicing witchcraft to harm his son. Haitian security forces remain almost certainly unable to deter the gangs or significantly challenge their hold over large parts of the country. International support initiatives have, so far, likely proved equally ineffective. The UN-backed, Kenyan-led multinational security support mission failed by the time of its conclusion in October 2025 to free the capital from gang control. As of March 2026, the UN assesses that gangs still control up to 90% of Port-au-Prince. The Haitian government's plan to deploy private security contractors to conduct operations against gang strongholds has also almost certainly proved counterproductive. Several reported cases of drone strikes killing civilians have triggered significant international backlash. In April, the MSS will be replaced by another UN-backed effort, known as the Gang Suppression Force, or GSF. The force is expected to comprise approximately 5,500 personnel, and, according to U.S. Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz, will operate under a strengthened mandate to counter gang activity. However, this is likely too small a force to dislodge the entrenched gangs. These groups have consolidated control over much of the country and retain the ability to sustain coordinated attacks, control key routes, and blend into the civilian population to evade detection and security operations. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Ukraine has significantly escalated its deep strike campaign against Russian oil and defense infrastructure. Ukrainian forces have sustained a high-tempo campaign targeting Russian oil and defense industrial infrastructure, with a particular focus on Leningrad Oblast. Strikes on oil facilities in the region on March 26th to 27th marked the fourth such attack in 5 days. These were followed by further strikes on March 27th to 28th, using Ukraine's newly developed FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles, alongside FP-1 long-range one-way attack drones, targeting both defense industrial sites in Samara Oblast and additional oil infrastructure. On March 28th to 29th, further strikes hit Ust-Luga and other oil facilities in Leningrad Oblast. Then, on March 31st, international media reported that Ukrainian one-way attack drones had again struck Baltic oil infrastructure, marking the fifth such attack in just over a week. On March 27th, Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly requested that oligarchs contribute to the state budget to support the war effort, although the Kremlin publicly denied the claim. Meanwhile, on March 27th and 28th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed defense cooperation agreements with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. According to available open-source research, Ukraine conducted at least 565 one-way attack drone strikes across both occupied Ukrainian territory and the Russian Federation in March 2026. This marks a significantly higher total than in any other month since the start of the war in 2014. Ukraine is also increasingly deploying its newly developed Flamingo cruise missile, further enhancing its deep strike capabilities. As a domestically produced system, it can be used with far fewer external restrictions by Kyiv. It is highly likely that Ukraine's deep strike campaign is generating a cumulative economic impact, rather than causing only limited disruption. As of March 25th, it was estimated that at least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity had been halted. If accurate, this would represent the most significant disruption to Russian oil supply in its modern history. The economic impact is almost certainly also reflected in Putin's reported attempts to extract funds from oligarchs, likely in an effort to offset the severe effects of Ukrainian strikes on Russian state income. There is also a realistic possibility that this initial request could set the conditions for more directly coercive methods of appropriating funds from Russian oligarchs, should Russia's economic situation further deteriorate. Such measures would highly likely generate internal resentment towards the Kremlin. The escalation of Ukraine's campaign is also unfolding in the context of the ongoing war in the Middle East, with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, in particular, driving the price of a barrel of crude oil to over $108 as of April 2nd. Rising fuel prices are almost certainly beneficial to Russia, given its high level of energy self-sufficiency and the substantial revenues it derives from oil and gas exports. This dynamic has highly likely conditioned the sharp escalation in Ukrainian strikes, with Kyiv likely calculating that its campaign would need to intensify in order to offset increased Russian state revenues. This is despite President Zelensky stating that Ukraine had received signals from its allies to scale back the campaign in response to the surge in global energy prices. In addition to rising fuel prices, the war in the Middle East has also contributed to Ukraine signing defense cooperation agreements with several Gulf states. These agreements have almost certainly been pursued by Gulf countries to access Ukrainian expertise, as well as its cost-effective and efficient counter-drone systems. The Russian Geran and Gerbera one-way attack drones are iterative versions of the Iranian Shahed family. Ukraine has become highly effective at intercepting these systems at high rates and relatively low cost. By contrast, while Gulf states have achieved higher interception rates against ballistic missiles than Ukraine, they have struggled to counter Shahed-type one-way attack drones at comparable levels. The United Arab Emirates Agreement is particularly notable, given its close relations with Russia. Multiple sources also indicate that Russia has been supporting Iran with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities via its satellites. In combination with the Gulf states' urgent need for Ukraine's counter-UAS capabilities, this dynamic has likely further strained Russia's relationships with partners in the Middle East. Staying in the region, tensions between the United States and Iran continue to rise, with peace proposals effectively rejected and the risk of escalation increasing. On March 25, Iran announced that it had received a 15-point peace proposal from Washington, but stated that this does not mean negotiations with the U.S. In what amounts to an effective rejection, Tehran presented a 5-point counterproposal, which included the exercise of sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump's claims of ongoing negotiations with Iran have been repeatedly denied by Tehran. However, Germany's foreign minister and Pakistani officials have indicated that indirect contacts have taken place and that preparations may be underway for a potential US-Iran meeting in Pakistan. On March 27, U.S. President Donald Trump extended the deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by 10 days, setting a new deadline of April 6. The following day, March 28, U.S. Central Command announced that the USS Tripoli, carrying around 2,200 Marines, had entered its area of responsibility on March 27. A further 2,000 U.S. Army paratroopers have reportedly been ordered to deploy to the region. In addition, U.S. media reports suggest that the Pentagon is considering the deployment of up to 10,000 additional ground troops. On March 30th, President Donald Trump stated on social media that great progress has been made in claimed discussions with Iran. However, he warned that if a deal is not shortly reached, and if the Strait of Hormuz is not immediately reopened, the United States would conclude the war by completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants, oil wells, and Karg Island, and possibly all desalination plants. On April 1st, President Trump delivered a televised address in which he said he expects the war to last another 2 to 3 weeks. He also reiterated threats to send Iran back to the Stone Ages if it does not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. While the details of Washington's 15-point peace plan remain unconfirmed, Iran is highly unlikely to agree to all of its provisions. It is unlikely that Tehran will accept concessions that significantly weaken its future deterrence against renewed U.S. and/or Israeli attacks, such as strict limits on its ballistic missile program or its support for proxy forces. Iran is more likely to consider movement limited to the nuclear file. However, regional actors, notably the Gulf states, now alongside Israel, highly likely fear any agreement that leaves Iran as a weakened but still hostile state, retaining broad ballistic missile capabilities, continued support for proxy forces, and control over the Strait of Hormuz. Many senior figures in Tehran likely assess that Washington's attempts at peace negotiations may be a ruse. This view is shaped by deep distrust, reinforced by the US and Israeli campaign being launched following what had appeared to be relative progress in Oman-mediated talks. It is also influenced by the deployment of US ground forces to the region, which, as of April 2nd, remains limited in scale, but is capable of supporting restricted ground operations. While a large-scale US ground invasion of mainland Iran remains highly unlikely in the near term, Washington's options for limited ground operations and its overall operational flexibility are expanding alongside the increased deployment of expeditionary forces to the region. Washington has also likely calculated that deploying ground forces, particularly units that typically form the vanguard of US operations, such as airborne forces, increases its leverage over Tehran and lends credibility to threats to seize key terrain. However, the increasingly IRGC-controlled regime likely assesses that it could impose significant political, military, and economic costs on the United States if ground operations were launched, and that it would survive in some form even in the event of a large-scale campaign. The regime also likely judges that any such operation would require congressional approval, a factor that may not favor President Trump. Potential ground operations include the seizure of Iran's Karg Island, which is of critical economic importance to Tehran, with around 90% of its crude oil exports passing through the Karg Island terminal. This remains the most likely near-term ground operation, as it would likely require fewer personnel and carry less risk than a direct assault on the Iranian mainland. However, Karg's close proximity to the mainland would leave any occupying force highly exposed to sustained attack, including rocket artillery, as well as missiles and one-way attack drones. Furthermore, the primary issue under negotiation in the Oman-mediated US-Iran talks prior to the outbreak of hostilities, Iran's nuclear program, is highly unlikely to be resolved through aerial strikes alone. A military resolution would likely require ground operations to achieve a comprehensive and lasting outcome, absent a diplomatic breakthrough. It is assessed that most of Iran's enriched uranium is deeply buried at Isfahan, with additional stockpiles at Natanz. Both sites are located deep Dakhil Iran and would be extremely difficult to access. Larger-scale ground operations could seek to occupy parts of the Iranian coast along the Strait of Hormuz. However, this would highly likely require a substantial deployment of forces and would almost certainly expose US personnel to significant risk from Iranian ground forces. The United States now likely has only limited options to coerce the Iranian regime into a peace deal, and the Strait of Hormuz blockade is unlikely to be militarily resolved in the short term under the current force posture. There is only a remote chance that Washington can secure a politically acceptable end state for regional actors, with concessions significantly beyond those achieved through diplomacy, without a major escalation involving large-scale deployments comparable to the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. However, this does not preclude the possibility that the White House may judge the costs of the war to be too high and opt to unilaterally cease further operations against Iran in exchange for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and concessions on the nuclear program. Across the Gulf, Iranian attacks and threats are increasingly focused on critical infrastructure and US-linked commercial assets. Daily Iranian strikes against Gulf states have continued through to April 2nd. Notable recent incidents include an attack on March 26th, when 2 people were killed and several others injured after ballistic missile debris fell onto Swayhan Road in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. On March 27th, a combined ballistic missile and one-way attack drone strike targeted Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, wounding more than a dozen U.S. personnel, at least 2 of them seriously, and reportedly destroying an E-3 Sentry aircraft. That same day, March 27th, one-way attack drones and cruise missiles struck Mubarak al-Kabir port and Shuwaik port in Kuwait, causing material damage but no reported injuries. On March 28th, several one-way attack drones hit Kuwait International Airport, damaging a radar system, but again causing no casualties. On March 29th, a power and desalination plant in Kuwait was struck, resulting in 1 fatality. Meanwhile, overnight between March 28th and 29th, further strikes caused fires in the Khalifa Industrial Zone in Abu Dhabi, where at least 5 people were injured. On March 31st, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stated that it would begin targeting U.S. companies in the region from April 1st in retaliation for attacks on Iran. The IRGC published a list of 18 U.S. companies with a corporate presence in the region. All 18 companies maintain a regional footprint across the Middle East, with offices, data centers, or commercial operations primarily concentrated in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, alongside additional operations in Qatar, Bahrain, and Israel. President Donald Trump's threats on March 30th to destroy Iran's power plants, and potentially even its desalination facilities, will almost certainly shape Iranian strategy towards the Gulf states. These threats were made in the context of a previously issued 10-day ultimatum for Iran to agree to a peace deal and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, set to expire at 2000 Eastern Time on April 6. They also coincide with a developing, though still limited, build-up of U.S. Marines and Army paratroopers in the region, as well as earlier threats from IRGC-linked media targeting power and desalination infrastructure in response to potential U.S. strikes. On March 31st, an Iranian health ministry official stated that a desalination plant on Keshem Island had been completely out of service since an alleged strike earlier in March. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The scale of Iranian ballistic missile and attack drone strike packages launched against the Gulf states has decreased since February 28th. However, regular drone attacks and lower volume ballistic missile strikes are likely to remain frequent in the short to medium term, with Iran likely conserving sufficient capabilities to sustain operations for at least several more weeks. At the same time, high rates of interceptor usage are likely depleting air defense stockpiles in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. This may force systems to prioritize targets, increasing the likelihood of successful penetrations. Overall, penetration rates are already rising, despite the lower volume of incoming projectiles compared to the early stages of the conflict. The alleged U.S. and or Israeli strike on a desalination plant on Keshem Island reportedly took place on March 7th, although both Washington and Tel Aviv have denied responsibility. The following day, March 8th, an Iranian attack drone strike caused material damage to a desalination plant in Bahrain. A further desalination facility was targeted in Kuwait on March 28th. Iran's reference to the alleged U.S.-Israeli strike on a similar facility within its own territory several weeks earlier is likely intended to signal future targeting intent and to frame any strikes against desalination infrastructure in the Gulf as reciprocal action. Taken together, Iranian activity and President Trump's threats against Iran's critical national infrastructure, including desalination plants, almost certainly increase the risk of retaliatory Iranian strikes targeting critical infrastructure across the Gulf states. Following President Trump's initial ultimatum earlier in March, the IRGC-linked Fars news agency published a list of potential targets for retaliatory strikes. The Gulf states are highly dependent on desalination for drinking water, as well as for domestic and industrial use. Between 90 and 99% of drinking water in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE is derived from desalination. The figure stands at 86% in Oman and around 70% in Saudi Arabia. Sustained attacks on desalination infrastructure would likely have severe consequences for national water security across the Gulf. The IRGC's threat to target U.S. companies in the region was followed by a further drone strike on an Amazon data center in Bahrain. Air defenses were also activated over Dubai, and damage was reported in Khalifa Economic Zone's Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. These incidents were highly likely linked to the threat issued the previous day, given the presence of multiple U.S. corporate offices in Dubai and an additional Amazon site within KEZAD. Targeting U.S.-linked commercial infrastructure is likely intended to impose economic costs on both the United States and host nations, while undermining confidence in the regional business environment without directly striking state facilities. Data centers, in particular, may be prioritized targets, as the U.S. military is increasingly reliant on advanced artificial intelligence capabilities for decision support. Capabilities that such infrastructure helps to enable. The continued publication of large and varied target lists, ranging from data centers in industrial zones to corporate offices in major urban centers and critical national infrastructure across affected states, has likely been intended to complicate adversarial decision-making. Expansive, evolving, and geographically dispersed target sets will likely force host nations to stretch air defense and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance resources across a wider area. This is likely to reduce coverage density and increase the probability of successful Iranian penetrations, particularly at a time when Iran's stockpiles of offensive systems are gradually decreasing. Sustained Iranian attacks are likely increasing the chances of direct Gulf state participation in the conflict. Multiple reports indicate that Riyadh has already supported U.S. strikes and is considering more direct involvement. Given the scale and persistence of Iranian attacks, the Saudi leadership is likely assessing that deterrence may need to be re-established through offensive operations, but is holding back until Iran has been sufficiently degraded. Direct involvement by Gulf states would not only raise the risk of broader regional escalation, but would also likely trigger an increased tempo of Iranian strikes and proxy attacks against them, for as long as weapon stockpiles allow. Also in the region, the Houthis have entered the conflict with attempted strikes against Israel, raising the risk of wider regional disruption. On March 28, the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen carried out a series of attempted strikes targeting Israel. The Israel Defense Forces stated that a cruise missile was intercepted before reaching Israeli airspace, while a long-range one-way attack drone was later intercepted over Eilat. On March 30th, the IDF reported that a further 2 one-way attack drones launched from Yemen were also intercepted. These were the first confirmed Houthi attacks since the start of the current Middle East conflict on February 28th, marking their entry into the war. In a statement, the group claimed to have targeted sensitive Israeli military sites and vowed to continue its attacks. On March 31st, Houthi Deputy Information Minister Mohammed Mansour stated in an interview that the option of closing the Bab al-Mandab Strait is a Yemeni option that can be implemented if the conflict escalates further, or if any Gulf state becomes directly involved in military operations in support of Israel or the United States. Now our intelligence team's assessment. While the Houthis' involvement has, so far, been limited to strikes against Israel, their entry into the conflict raises concerns about further escalation. The group could expand its operations by resuming attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and the Gulf of Aden, or by conducting strikes against targets across the Arabian Peninsula. Both courses of action align with capabilities and intent the Houthis have demonstrated during previous periods of heightened tension. The Houthis are almost certainly the most capable Iran-backed proxy force in the region. However, Tehran highly likely exercises less direct control over them than it does over other groups within the so-called axis of resistance, such as Lebanese Hezbollah. Despite this relative autonomy, the Houthis remain heavily reliant on Iran for funding and sustainment. At the same time, the degradation of Iran and Hezbollah as military threats will likely leave the Houthis increasingly exposed. As Israeli military resources are freed up, they can be redirected towards other Iranian-aligned actors, raising the risk of future Israeli operations against Houthi targets. During the civil war in Yemen, from 2014 to 2022, in which a Saudi-led coalition intervened in support of the internationally recognized Yemeni government, the Houthis carried out multiple attacks against targets in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, including international airports and oil and gas infrastructure. The Houthis are likely cautious about resuming hostilities with Saudi Arabia, given the potentially significant threat posed by a renewed full-scale conflict. This would also almost certainly result in the loss of Saudi financial support tied to longer-standing agreements. However, Houthi attacks against Saudi Arabia cannot be ruled out, particularly if the Iranian regime comes under an existential threat. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed to most maritime traffic, the Saudi port of Yanbu on the Red Sea has become increasingly critical for global crude supply. The Houthis retain the capability to disrupt this route by resuming attacks on vessels and potentially attempting to close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. Moreover, the United Arab Emirates has backed the separatist Southern Transitional Council in Yemen, a group that was reportedly preparing for potential ground operations against the Houthis before its disbandment in early 2026 following clashes with the Saudi-backed Yemeni government. The Houthis have also demonstrated their willingness to target the UAE directly. As recently as January 2022, they carried out an attack using long-range drones and ballistic missiles, striking fuel trucks near Abu Dhabi International Airport and killing 3 civilians. The Houthis' threat to close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait in response to potential Gulf state involvement is highly likely intended as a deterrent. Such a move would have a substantial impact, particularly at a time when the Strait of Hormuz is already severely disrupted. However, there remains a realistic possibility that the Houthis could escalate beyond maritime disruption and conduct long-range missile and UAV attacks against Gulf states. This would align with their established targeting patterns, demonstrate solidarity with Iran, and impose additional economic costs on US-aligned states. Houthi involvement would also open a new attack axis from the south, likely forcing Gulf states to reposition and stretch their air defense systems. This, in turn, would increase the likelihood of successful penetrations. And in East Africa, the forced resignation of a regional leader in Somalia highlights rising tensions between federal and regional authorities. On March 30th, Somali federal forces took control of Baidoa, the largest city and administrative center of Southwest State, and a hub for international peacekeepers and humanitarian agencies. Somali army units advanced over several days, supported by Turkish air power, to reduce the risk of militant ambushes. When they reached the city, they encountered minimal resistance. Regional forces withdrew, allowing federal troops to take control of key installations, including the police station and the central business district. At least 2 people were killed and 25 injured in the clashes. According to the United Nations, around 45,000 people have been displaced by the recent tensions. Following the city's capture, the president of Southwest State, Abdiaziz Hassan Mohamed Laftagarin, resigned. Laftagarin had been re-elected just 2 days earlier, on March 28th, in disputed regional elections. His current whereabouts are unclear, although reports indicate that he is in exile in Kenya. Southwest State's finance minister, Ahmed Mohamed Hussein, has since assumed the role of acting president through a formal decree. In a statement, Somali Information Minister Daoud Awais said the government remains committed to stability, protecting lives and property, and ensuring no persecution or retaliation, adding that any such acts would not be tolerated. Commercial flights to Baidoa's Chatti-Gadoud International Airport resumed on March 31st, after being suspended since March 18th. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Tensions between Mogadishu and several federal states have remained high since March 2024, when Somalia's federal parliament approved major constitutional amendments. These changes would move the country towards direct elections, extend political terms from 4 to 5 years, and expand presidential powers. Notably, the electoral system has been revised so that voters elect members of parliament, who then elect the president, a system that many regional leaders believe could be used to rig the outcome. The amendments have been strongly contested by several regional actors who argue that Mogadishu is unilaterally altering the federal arrangement without sufficient consensus, while centralizing executive power. This reflects a persistent tension within Somalia's federal model, as successive national leaders have sought to govern in a more unitary manner. Somaliland, for example, has rejected any role in Somalia's federal system since the fall of Siad Barre in 1991. Following the constitutional changes, 3 additional states moved to distance themselves from the federal government. Puntland withdrew recognition in March 2024. Jubaland suspended ties in November 2024, and Southwest State has now also opposed Mogadishu over the reforms. There is a realistic possibility that further federal states could follow, increasing the risk of additional violence between Mogadishu and regional forces. However, the rapid collapse of regional resistance, followed by Laftagarine's resignation, almost certainly represents a show of force by Mogadishu, likely intended to deter further opposition from other federal states. Tensions had already escalated on March 17th, when Southwest State announced it was suspending cooperation with the federal government, accusing Mogadishu of interfering in its internal affairs, arming militias, and attempting to remove Laftagarine. This unfolded in the lead-up to the regional election in Southwest State, which Mogadishu declared invalid. The federal government argued that Laftagarine's mandate had already expired, meaning his administration no longer had the legal authority to organize a legitimate presidential vote. A similar situation unfolded in Jubaland, where regional elections opposed by Mogadishu in November 2024 triggered clashes between federal and regional forces. Taken together, these cases almost certainly set a precedent for direct military intervention by Mogadishu if regional leaders attempt to defy its electoral model by holding elections outside the national reform framework. The constitutional amendments also delay the presidential election by extending the term from 4 to 5 years. As a result, elections that were due to take place by June 2026 will highly likely be pushed back to June 2027. This almost certainly increases the risk of instability in the year leading up to the vote, with disputes over the amendments likely to drive further clashes between federal and regional forces. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, protests in Nepal have followed the arrest of former Prime Minister Oli, with further unrest possible depending on the legal process. Nepal experienced renewed unrest on March 28 after Oli, along with former Home Minister Ramesh Lekak, was arrested over allegations linked to a failure to prevent dozens of deaths during the September 2025 crackdown on youth-led protests. Oli's party, the Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Marxist-Leninist, filed a legal complaint over the arrest on the same day. In a Facebook post, Home Minister Sudan Gurung wrote, "A promise is a promise, no one is above the law," adding that, "This is not vengeance against anyone, it is simply the beginning of justice. I believe the country is now headed in a new direction." In Kathmandu, demonstrations were organized by the All Nepal National Free Students Union, the student wing of the CPN-UML. Protesters gathered outside the district court, where local media reported clashes with police as demonstrators attempted to push through barricades and lit a bonfire. Police stated that 7 people were arrested during a protest in the Singa Durbar area. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The arrests follow widespread youth-led anti-government protests that began on September 8, 2025. These demonstrations quickly evolved into a broader anti-corruption movement, with mass protests across Kathmandu and several other cities. The unrest escalated significantly, culminating in the burning of Nepal's parliament building and widespread clashes with police and security forces, who responded with live ammunition. In total, an estimated 76 people were killed and more than 2,000 were injured. In response, the military imposed a curfew, which ultimately brought the violence to an end. The protests also led to the lifting of a social media ban and the resignation of Prime Minister Oli. A government-backed commission investigating the conduct of security forces during the caretaker administration recommended that Oli be prosecuted. According to the report, it was not established that there was an order to shoot, but it found that no effort was made to stop or control the firing, and, due to their negligent conduct, even minors lost their lives. The findings almost certainly provide the newly elected government with a political advantage, allowing it to distance itself from previous administrations that were widely perceived as corrupt. Despite the small-scale clashes, protests are unlikely to escalate. The arrest came just one day after newly elected Prime Minister Balendra Shah and his cabinet were sworn in following a landslide victory, and the population likely wants to avoid further bloodshed. However, the investigation is still ongoing, and Oli has not been formally charged. There is a realistic possibility that, if charges are not brought, further protests could be organized demanding his prosecution. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.